As a former Mandarin Chinese teacher, the biggest complaint I hear from learners is the tones. That's where changing the pitch of a word changes the meaning completely. Say a tone wrong and you end up calling your mom a horse. You know what I'm talking about. As Mandarin is my first language, I never really considered tones to be a weird linguistic feature until I immigrated to the US. That's when I found out that languages in the West, English, Spanish, French, German, don't tend to be tonal. So when people try to learn Mandarin, they often balk at Mandarin's four tones. But what many people don't know is that tonal languages make up more than half of the world's 7,000 languages.
I'm sorry, what?
If you look at a world map, tones are clustered heavily in two regions, East and Southeast Asia and Sub-Saharan Africa. In East and Southeast Asia, you've got languages like Mandarin, Cantonese, Thai, Vietnamese, where tone is very obvious. Same syllable, different pitch, completely different meaning. In Sub-Saharan Africa, tone works a little differently. It's not only used to distinguish words, tone can also carry grammatical meaning. For example, changing the pitch of a syllable might change things like tense or plurality. These two regions, Asia and Africa, contain a huge proportion of the world's languages. We can see that tones aren't the weird exception. They're actually the default. Which brings us to the real question. If tones are so common across these regions, then why did they develop there in the first place? And why didn't they develop in most European languages? Now, before I turn this video into a Linguistics 101 seminar, I wanted to talk to you a bit about myself. When I was in middle school, I fell in love with French. I had to pick a foreign language, and I picked French because it sounded pretty. I ended up falling in love with the culture, and I dreamed of studying abroad in France. But sadly, my French skills did not match up to my passion. But things have changed. Middle school me would be amazed at all the resources there are for language learning now, especially LingoPie. It's essentially the Netflix of language learning. LingoPie combines everything I liked about France, the movies, the music, the culture, into a single platform where I can see both the French and the English subtitles at the same time. Watch, I click on any word I don't know and I get the translation right there.
Je sortais.
Je sortais. It saves it automatically so I can review it later through LingoPie's games and flashcards. So whether you're brushing up on a language you used to know or are obsessed with a language for the first time, the app meets you where you are. Recently, I've become good friends with a French person. We only ever communicate in English, but I've been using LingoPie daily for the past 2 weeks, and I'm finally going to challenge myself to speak to her only in French. Wish me luck. By the way, LingoPie is available in 13 languages: French, Spanish, Korean, Chinese, to name a few. One subscription gets you access to the entire catalog. Try LingoPie totally free for 7 days by going to the link in the description, where you can also get 55% off the yearly plan. And now, back to the video. To start off, I'm going to give you a linguistics crash course, the way my favorite linguistics teacher taught me. Human speech is made up of two major types of sounds: consonants and vowels. Consonants are your B, D, P, T type of sounds, and vowels are A, E, I, O, U type sounds. You might have heard the saying that you can't make a word without a vowel, and there's a lot of truth to that. Essentially, consonants temporarily block the air coming out of your mouth. It's more or less instantaneous, which means that in order to communicate its sound effectively, we usually need to add a vowel to it. A vowel is essentially your mouth in an open position with sustained air coming out of it. You might think that consonants and vowels are all the same acoustically, but they're not. For example, vowels consist of height, backing, and rounding. A vowel like ah is low and backed. Your tongue is low in your mouth and pressed backwards. A vowel like e is high and fronted. Your tongue is high in your mouth, closer to the teeth. Similarly, consonants, depending on the way they're produced, also lead to lower or higher pitches. Trying saying the word bet. Saying it naturally produces a rather low sound. Now try pet. This should produce a slightly higher sound. That's because the B in bet is a voice consonant, which means that the vocal cords in your throat are vibrating when producing the sound. The P in pet is voiceless, which means the vocal cords aren't vibrating. This is a phenomenon that occurs naturally. Linguists have tested the F0 or pitch of the vowel following voiced and voiceless consonants, and there is a real pitch difference. We don't tend to notice that pet is slightly higher than bet because we're more focused on the B and the P. These two words are what we call a minimal pair in linguistics, two words that differ in only one phoneme or sound in the same position. Now, just as a hypothetical, what would happen if the P and the B differences were to weaken over time and collapse into one sound? Let's say P. Now we wouldn't be able to tell the two words apart, right? Well, that would be a huge problem, wouldn't it? There must be dozens, if not hundreds of minimal pairs this would affect. And the language may soon become very confusing. But luckily for us, the pitch differences from the original sounds carry over. Words that began with P would retain the higher pitch, and the words that began with B but is now a P would retain the lower pitch. So instead of a consonant doing the heavy lifting, the pitch of the consonant syllable has taken over. Crisis averted.
Yay!
Well, this hypothetical actually happened in Middle Chinese, for example. About 1,000 years ago, give or take, Middle Chinese had voiced initial sounds, but they slowly disappeared. In Mandarin Chinese now, we differentiate those words that were lost when voice sounds disappeared, partially due to the many tones we have today. This is a phenomenon called tonogenesis, where lexical tone emerged in a context where there was no tone previously. Tonogenesis is often seen as a compensatory measure when the syllable structure of a language changes, like when its initial consonants become unvoiced. In 1954, André Georges Auducourt, a French botanist, anthropologist, and linguist, came to this very conclusion about Vietnamese. According to Auducourt, an initial consonant's disappearance accounted for the relative height of the tone of the syllable, whether it's low or high. And when the final consonant disappeared, it would be phonologized as tone contour, whether it's rising or falling, for example. Because just like how voice consonants at the beginning of a syllable causes the entire syllable to be lower, consonants at the end of the syllable influences the pitch direction of the tone. For example, say the word has. Do you feel your mouth going down slightly? The pitch goes down slightly toward the end of the word. And that's because the Z at the end of has is a fricative, a type of consonant that involves forcing air through a narrow space, and it causes gradual energy loss. And this tends to drop the F0 or pitch at the end of a syllable. Over time, when the fricative weakens or disappears, that pitch gets phonologized as a falling tone. Different final consonants gets phonologized as different contours. Some are falling, but others are rising or flat. Okay, I know what you're thinking. This all makes logical sense, but why would consonants just up and disappear? Well, unfortunately, there is no one reason, but there are a few trends that show up again and again in tonal languages. First, efficiency. In fast, everyday speech, we're constantly trying to reduce speaking effort. Take voice sounds at the beginning of syllables like B, D, or G. Producing a voice sound means your vocal cords have to vibrate while you're briefly stopping airflow. I mean, it's simply easier when you're speaking quickly to produce a voiceless sound, like P or T instead. At the other end of the syllable, final consonants, things like S or H, they have a different problem. They occur at the end of an articulatory movement where there's less energy and less precision. And speakers don't always articulate them clearly, and over time they start to weaken. A final consonant like S might become H and then disappear altogether. And this is what linguists believe happened in Old Chinese. Second, aerodynamic constraints. Voice stops are actually kind of unstable from a physics standpoint. In some studies, so-called voice sounds like the B in English are only fully voiced about half the time. So over time, the sound just kind of disappears. And on the other hand, when it comes to final consonants like P, T, or K, when you produce them, you immediately block airflow. And then the syllable just ends. And because of that, final stops are often weakly realized. Over time, they weaken and may fade completely. And that's what happened from Middle Chinese to modern Mandarin Chinese. The final P, T, and K have disappeared, but the lexical distinctions are retained in the form of contour tones. Everything we've talked about so far explains how tone can develop. But that still leaves a bigger question. Why are so many of these tonal languages clustered in the same part of the world? In East and Southeast Asia, you have languages from completely different language families. Sino-Tibetan, Tai-Kadai, Hmong-Mien, and Austroasiatic languages. Many of them have tone. That raises the question, did tones develop once and spread? Or do they somehow develop multiple times independently, close to each other? Linguists generally think the answer is somewhere in between. These languages are what is known in linguistics as a linguistic area, or Sprachbund. That means they're not necessarily closely related to each other, but they've been in contact for a long time and have influenced each other structurally. Within this area, the Sino-Tibetan languages, especially the Chinese ones, are often considered important because they developed tone relatively early. Over a long period of time, Chinese languages were in contact with neighboring languages through trade, administration, and cultural exchange. At the same time, other language families in the region were undergoing similar phonetic changes internally. Many, but not all, languages in this area had simple CVC syllable structures. And when consonants weakened, especially at the beginning and end of syllables, this created the same kind of pitch differences we talked about earlier. Since similar sound changes were happening across multiple languages, contact between those languages made it that much more likely that tone would stabilize and persist. There are also some exceptions that help make this clearer. Austronesian languages, for example, are mostly not tonal, especially on the island parts of Southeast Asia. But in areas where Austronesian languages have been in closer contact with tonal languages on the mainland, such as Cham or Jarai in Vietnam, some of them show tone-like features. And this again points to contact as an important factor to tonogenesis. But if this process, consonants weakening and pitch taking over, is so normal, why didn't the same thing happen in Europe? Languages like English, French, German all went through major sound changes over time, but they didn't end up developing tone. One difference is syllable structure. As I mentioned earlier, difficult to produce sounds tend to become simpler over time. Take the words knife, knee, and night. As we can tell from the spelling, historically, they were pronounced with a K at the beginning, a consonant cluster, kn, objectively difficult to say. Over time, people stopped pronouncing the K. But nothing replaced it. It just lost the sound. And that's because many European languages allow fairly complex consonant clusters, or consonants, together. In English, for example, you can have up to 3 consonants at the beginning of a word and 4 at the end of words. So even when European languages do lose consonants, there are still other sounds in the word that carry contrast, making tonal contrasts unnecessary. Stress is another important factor. Many European languages make use of stress. Acoustically, stress syllables are longer, louder and often slightly higher in pitch than the surrounding syllables. It's not tone per se, but a combination of pitch, prominence, and duration, and sometimes that helps differentiate words. In English, stress can distinguish words like produce as a noun versus produce as a verb. This pattern is somewhat common across noun-verb pairs in English. It can be seen in permit and permit, and record and record, among others. And it's not just pitch. Stress also changes the vowel itself. Unstressed vowels get reduced, while stressed vowels stay clear. And in a language, having lexical stress tends to preclude the need for lexical tones. However, there are also some European languages that make more precise use of pitch. Languages like Swedish and Norwegian have what we call pitch accent systems. For example, in Swedish, the word anden can be either the duck or the spirit, depending on the pitch pattern. However, these kinds of minimal pairs in Swedish are not that common, and the pitch accent is usually accompanied by consonant and vowel differences as well. Lastly, grammar also plays a role, but indirectly. Many European languages use affixes to mark things like tense, number, and case, and that keeps words relatively long and gives the language multiple ways to maintain distinctions or contrasts. For example, in Spanish, verbs carry a lot of information through endings. Hablo means I speak, hablas means you speak, and hablan means they speak. And even if some sounds were reduced, those endings still provide clear distinctions. There's less pressure for things like pitch to become contrastive. You might have noticed that I mentioned that African languages make up a large part of global tonal languages, but I haven't explained them yet. And there's a reason for that. Even though Sino-Tibetan languages were some of the first in Asia to develop tone, many tonal systems in sub-Saharan Africa are likely even older. When linguists try to reconstruct early African languages, tone is already there. That means that even if we try our best to trace the origin of African languages, we still have difficulty figuring out how they developed tones in the first place. However, with the research that we do have so far, we can see that the same principles that caused tones to emerge in Asia play similar roles in African tonal languages today. Thank you for coming on this tone journey with me. I've wanted to talk about tonogenesis for quite a while now, and I feel like now was a time where I could finally do it a little bit of justice. For the purposes of the video, I simplified many concepts related to how tones emerge. However, all statements made here about tonogenesis are speculative. They're based on our collective knowledge up until this point, and the study of this topic isn't much more than 100 years old. For those of you who are wondering why Japanese and Korean weren't included in this video, that is not because I forgot about them. There are interesting stories surrounding why they didn't develop tones in the way that other countries in the Sinosphere did, but I think that would be better kept for another video. So my PhD research was all about Mandarin tones, and so tones is a very, very dear to me. And when I speak to people whose mother language isn't tonal, I feel like I constantly have to defend tone's usefulness as a phonological feature. But I hope this video speaks for itself. Tones are an integral part of how languages evolve and change as a whole, and its development follows universal patterns that all languages share. Thanks again for watching this video, and let me know what you like the most in this video, and see you in the next one. Bye!